It's fair to say that Elon Musk is a polarizing figure. Some view him as a visionary savior of humanity, others a selfish billionaire wasting money on bad ideas. In truth, he seems to genuinely care about the existential threats facing humanity. They're legitimate problems, and it's good that he wants to contribute to fixing them. You might therefore be forgiven for thinking that he must have a good vision for society more widely as well. But beyond the basic survival of the species, big parts of his worldview are dangerous. A society built according to Musk's ideals wouldn't be fair to the people living in it. Many people look up to him, and as he helps launch humanity into space, he may shape the lives of many more even beyond his own lifetime. But even if you appreciate his entrepreneurial zeal and drive to propel us to a green and cosmic future, please don't take his broader worldview as an instruction manual on how to build a good society. Let me explain why. To start with, he has a tendency towards the bad sides of libertarianism. And don't get me wrong, it's not all bad. He became a meme overnight for smoking cannabis on the Joe Rogan podcast, and has advocated for it and other drugs to be legalized and normalized. And he's warned about the risks of social media companies deciding what is and isn't free speech. But too often, his affinity for individual freedom comes at the expense of society at large. And COVID shone a very bright light on the problem. As the virus swept through America in early 2020, local governments imposed lockdowns, which infuriated Musk. He labelled factory closures as fascist, said people's freedoms were being broken, and dismissed the public reaction as a dumb panic. He even reopened his factory in defiance of the lockdown, challenging authorities to arrest him. That flew in the face of the effort to stop the virus, and made his employees pick between risking arrest by authorities or retribution by their managers. The virus went on to take over 5 million lives. Perhaps all this wore him down. By the end of 2020, he moved to Texas. Some thought California's heavy regulatory hand was to blame, compared with Texas's light touch. And he did criticize California's over-regulation on his way out. But in reality, he probably just wanted to get closer to Tesla and SpaceX operations in Texas. I'm sure it had absolutely nothing to do with tax. Texas, which is, of course, the land of the free, so long as you don't have ovaries or want an open-minded education. Of course, a CEO wouldn't normally be expected to comment on social issues like those, but for someone so vocal about liberty, his silence is curious, and vague statements of fundamental principles don't really cut it. Meanwhile, it isn't just earthly matters where he's voiced a concerning stance on liberty. He wants a future Mars colony to be governed by direct democracy. I don't want to get into whether that's right or wrong for now, but it's how he wants that democracy to work which raises red flags. Most concerningly, he wants 40% of the population to be able to abolish any law. In other words, even if a majority support a law, a minority could just veto it. This, he says, is all in the name of overcoming inertia, which is a clever euphemism for disagreement. Inversely though, in order for anything to become law, it would need 60% support. And on top of that, every law would have an expiry date, so opponents could just wait for a law to die and hope that nobody can get together enough votes to pass that really high 60% threshold again. So Musk wants to make it easy to abolish laws, but difficult to make them. Disagreement is totally okay when you want to get rid of a law, but if you want to make one, it's sacred. But that could be really bad for people. It's stacking the cards in favor of freedom at the expense of society. It makes it difficult to do important things like public education and universal healthcare, as well as to pass laws stopping bad practices, abuse, and exploitation. And Musk isn't shy about prioritizing liberty. He's openly described himself as an American exceptionalist, saying that the US is the greatest country that's ever existed. His reason? The 2 world wars and the Cold War. I think a few people might take issue with America taking all the credit, but the big problem here is that he turns a really blind eye to the problems inside America. Fighting Nazis to defend freedom is very noble, but so too is building a happy and healthy society. And in these areas, America simply isn't the greatest country in the world. It's quite bizarre for Musk to ignore that, and it reveals a lot about where his priorities really lie and what he actually cares about. So his instinct for liberty is good some of the time, but at other times is a real problem. Sometimes his preference for liberty seems to simply be about getting his own way, whether that's operating his businesses regardless of a global pandemic, or making it difficult to create laws which he might not like, even if they could help people. He doesn't seem to appreciate that people need more than liberty to live a happy life, nor that liberty might sometimes need to be balanced with other concerns. If society was shaped the way he prioritizes liberty, that could be quite bad for people. It's the economy though, where we see Musk's worldview really shine through in a harmful way. He's quite the full-blooded free market capitalist, having even praised Ronald Reagan as a great president and an intellectual. He wants to see radical change in the role of government to make it smaller, which could exacerbate inequalities and injustice. At the end of 2021, he protested against efforts to tax the super rich, including himself, becoming embroiled in a series of Twitter skirmishes with figures like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Prompted in an interview to explain why he opposed new taxes, he revealed a remarkably narrow perspective on the role of government. In his view, the question of more or less tax is simply a matter of who is better at the allocation of capital. The government is really just the biggest corporation of them all, but it's really bad at capital allocation. By contrast, private investors and corporations like himself do a much better, much more efficient job of that. There's a few really big problems with this. To start with, governments are so much more than corporations. No doubt they have their fair share of problems, but democratic governments are at least elected by citizens to serve their best interests. So while it's true that a big part of what they do is the allocation of capital, they do that for entirely different reasons to for-profit corporations. They aren't driven by profit, they're driven to meet the interests of citizens. They spend money in ways corporations never would, on things like healthcare, social security, and education. Those things are really important to so many people. Indeed, Musk at least partly knows this in the back of his mind. He explicitly acknowledged that government is critical for things like spending on research in areas of science that corporations would never want to risk their money in. And it's no accident that he knows this. That kind of public spending is crucial to his businesses, which stand on the shoulders of government-funded research and development, including decades of space innovation by NASA. If he were to look beyond just the needs of his own businesses and priorities, he might find that the government spends money in other important areas as well. And public spending isn't the only thing governments do. They do another thing which is really critical, but which corporations don't do nearly as much. They regulate through law, agencies, law enforcement, and the courts. They try to make sure that people are safe from criminals, and indeed private corporations who might otherwise try to exploit or abuse them. Of course, Musk is well aware of regulation, it's just something he has a general aversion to. He's argued that regulation stifles startups, favours monopolies, and has implored government to just get out of the way of innovators. That might explain why it didn't feature in his conception of government. But Tesla itself demonstrates why regulation is so important. It's regulation that provides mistreated employees with a recourse for justice. It's regulation that might force the company to improve the production quality of its cars, and it's regulations which enabled Tesla to sell government-issued carbon emission credits for over $1 billion in 2020 alone. So, straight off the bat, Musk approaches the role of government from a narrow perspective which doesn't appreciate the important role it plays in helping people's lives. Now, he says he isn't an extreme libertarian who thinks the government shouldn't do anything, but he does ask us to minimize what the government does. So, how far should we minimize it? Well, he thinks that governments shouldn't spend more than 40% of GDP, which throws up further problems. To start with, multiple developed countries already spend way more than 40%. What would he cut out of the budget to reduce spending by such a huge amount, over 10% in some countries? He's given little detail on this. Indeed, it was public spending by NASA on the space race which makes a lot of what he does today at SpaceX possible. It's billions of dollars of subsidies and government contracts which have helped both Tesla and SpaceX get to where they are today. And it was even the US military's own research agency which put public money into building the foundation for the internet, on which he now tweets to complain about public spending. In fact, Musk's views on subsidies are really curious. He's estimated to have received almost $5 billion in subsidies over the years, but often speaks out against them in general as a waste of money. Perhaps he finds it hard to reconcile his free market instincts with being supported so strongly by public money. And while he does accept that government should spend some money, he's very selective over how it collects tax, raising more issues. He prefers consumption and inheritance taxes over income and capital gains taxes. But income taxes are the single largest source of revenue for the US government. And consumption taxes, like sales tax and VAT, are typically regressive, meaning they impose a greater burden on the poor than the rich, even though the rich can comfortably afford to contribute a lot more. Perhaps he wants consumption taxes exclusively on luxury items only the rich can afford, but even then, he hasn't provided any evidence that this could work. And if his preferred taxes didn't fill the massive gap left by the reduction of the traditional taxes he doesn't like, public spending would have to be cut, hurting a lot of people. Curiously though, the one really intriguing part of his free market outlook is his support for a universal basic income. He hasn't spelled out exactly why he supports the idea, but he thinks it's necessary to deal with automation, which is predicted to make a lot of people unemployed. Now, he wouldn't be the first libertarian to support the idea. One of the big things a basic income does is give people more freedom to live their lives the way they want. But I suspect this isn't primarily why Musk likes the idea. After all, he's typically more interested in the bigger picture than people's individual well-being. It's more likely the idea appeals to him as a capitalist. On some level, it's basically a permanent and regular economic stimulus, injecting money into the economy which people spend on products sold by businesses like his own. It's easy to imagine people spending their basic income towards buying a Tesla. That's good for Musk, and it just so happens to help people deal with automation as well. In the end, many people accept that the market needs to be in some ways free to develop a successful economy for the benefit of everyone. Both Tesla and SpaceX may have shortcomings, but they've contributed to pushing their industries forward. And maybe, just maybe, if Musk had a little more money at his disposal or hadn't been slowed down by regulations, good things might have happened even sooner. But Musk seems to make the error of extrapolating his personal experiences of his own business challenges to the economy as a whole, an economy which is filled with a lot of bad actors, and to a society which has a government responsible for so many more things than are relevant to him in his own daily life. It's natural for us to have a bias towards the things that matter most to us, and we might not always realize that. I can't speculate on whether Musk is aware of his bias, but it certainly looks like his thinking on the free market and government is very much focused on what matters in his own life. Sadly, he seems to lack a broader appreciation of the things which matter to society as a whole, to the daily lives of ordinary people, and as a result, his free market ideals would be quite harmful. Now, you might wonder, if this is how he thinks, how does he actually act in the real world? After all, actions speak louder than words. Well, the verdict isn't glowing. He's had quite a few issues in the workplace, and they don't reflect well on him, especially as a self-described nano-manager who is likely aware of a lot of what goes on in his own company. To start with, multiple investigations have found unsafe working conditions in Tesla factories. Between 2014 and 2017 alone, ambulances visited Tesla's Fremont factory over 100 times. And it withheld injury reports from authorities when in reality it had an injury rate above the industry average. Sometimes safety issues were allegedly caused simply because Musk didn't like the color yellow nor the warning sounds of vehicles. And safety hasn't been the only issue in the workplace. Tesla was forced to pay 2 former black employees compensation in 2021 for severe and persistent racial abuse. one receiving almost $140 million. And even when employees try to fight back, the company stacks the cards against them. It makes it hard for its American workers to get justice by imposing forced arbitration in their employment contracts. It's a private procedure which prevents them from appealing to the normal court system and produces worse outcomes for workers. And when workers have tried to unionize to better protect their interests within the company, both Musk and Tesla have clamped down hard on those efforts, even breaking the law by intimidating organizers and firing them. To top it off, the company made clear how it feels about employee complaints when it sold cyber whistles on its website, making fun of whistleblowers. So when Musk does have real power to help or hurt the lives of individual people, he has been known to drop the ball, failing to provide good and safe working conditions. At times, the company seems to take priority over people. In the end, Musk, like many people, is a complex person. He isn't one thing, but many things. He's right to warn about the existential threats facing humanity, and at least to some extent, he seems to put his money where his mouth is, dedicating a lot of his time and resources to initiatives like Tesla and SpaceX, which he feels are critical to saving our species. And it's good that he draws attention to some of the more earthly problems facing society, such as the human impact of the war on drugs, as well as the challenges around free speech and social media. It's therefore no surprise that many are inspired by him. And if he does play a big role in the settlement of Mars, many more may be inclined to follow his broader worldview as a model for building a good society. But I hope I have shown why that wouldn't be such a great idea. At root, his care for the human species doesn't seem to be matched by a care for the human person. His drive to preserve humanity at large is noble, but he doesn't seem to care nearly as much about individual human well-being. In narrowly chasing his own priorities, he doesn't seem to appreciate the wider concerns of humanity, and that leads him to favour a kind of society which wouldn't be fair to people. He demonstrates this again and again. His instinct for liberty is valid at times, but his reactions to COVID seem to dodge tough choices which would ultimately help people. He wants to be free of tax and regulations so he can do what matters to him, but by making it more difficult for government to help and protect people. And he understandably wants to improve his factory's productivity, but along the way, some of his workers suffer one way or another, and he hasn't been quick to fix that. If humanity does indeed defeat climate change and colonize the cosmos, people may be thankful to Musk for the part he played. But it won't be such a great future if society is shaped according to how Musk more widely thinks and acts in the world. People may be alive, certainly, but their lives won't be nearly as good as they could be. And that's the bottom line. Musk is right to want to defeat climate change and catapult humanity into space. But at least for now, big parts of his views on society more generally are more harmful than helpful. Hopefully, as time passes, he might gain a more nuanced worldview, caring more for the individual human experience, for the basic elements of life, for the billions of members of the species he cares so much to preserve. But until that day, a society shaped according to big parts of Musk's worldview would be unfair to people. So current and future generations would do well not to take that worldview as an instruction manual on how to build a good society,